and hear the screaming of the lamb.
Doctors are allegedly supposed to save lives, not terrify the living daylights out of you, but leave it to movies and TV to take that trust and completely shred it to pieces. Some of these so-called medical professionals treat human bodies like personal DIY projects, others have egos big enough to play God with science, and a few don't even bother pretending they're doing anything but pure evil. From mad scientists to morally bankrupt surgeons, these guys took the Hippocratic Oath and laughed in its face. The Hippocratic Oath, more like the hypocritical oath, am I right? Right, guys? These doctors all have one thing in common, and it's that you don't want to end up on their operating table. We're talking about surgeons who treat patients like disposable lab rats, scientists whose groundbreaking experiments involve breaking way too many actual bones, and doctors who swap out anesthesia for sheer brutality. And let's be honest, nothing's more terrifying than a villain who actually knows how the human body works. Whether it's TV or the big screen, these evil doctors remind us that sometimes the real nightmare isn't the disease, but the person holding the scalpel. So grab a seat, preferably not in your creepy doctor's waiting room, because in this video, we're going to be dissecting some of the most deranged, unhinged, and straight up terrifying doctors in all of pop culture. Before we get too deep into things, we have a very small request. If you like our content, please support us by subscribing to the channel. It's a small click for you, but for us, it means a lot. Thank you. Let's begin.
I'll help you catch him, Clarice.
Dr. Hannibal Lecter, the Silence of the Lambs Hannibal series. Is Hannibal Lecter the obvious top pick? Absolutely, but that doesn't make it any less deserved. If there's one doctor you should avoid at all costs, it's the cannibalistic serial killer psychiatrist. His patients? Let's just say he prefers them medium rare. First appearing in Silence of the Lambs in 1991 and later in 2001 with Hannibal and Red Dragon in 2002, the character is based on Thomas Harris's novels. Played iconically by Anthony Hopkins, which earned him an Academy Award for Best Actor and later explored in the TV series Hannibal by Mads Mikkelsen, Lecter takes the phrase "having someone for dinner" way too literally. Hannibal Lecter's family was bombed during World War II and both of his parents were killed, leaving him and his little sister Misha, who were taken hostage by Nazis. These captors resorted to cannibalism, eating Misha right in front of Hannibal and forcing him to eat a stew made from her remains. The horror shattered something deep inside Lecter, leaving him mute and obsessed with a taste for cannibalism and revenge. Years later, he became a respected psychiatrist in Baltimore and effortlessly blended into high society, but behind closed doors, he indulged in his true nature, committing a string of murders throughout the 1970s. In 1991's The Silence of the Lambs, FBI trainee Clarice Starling seeks Lecter's help to catch serial killer Buffalo Bill. Lecter, from behind bars, manipulates her while revealing disturbing truths, making him both an ally and a predator. In 2001's Hannibal, Lecter's crimes take an even darker turn. Lecter, now free, lives under a false identity in Italy while an old victim, Mason Verger, hunts him for revenge. Meanwhile, he attempts to reunite with Clarice and tries to break her mind, molding her into a reflection of Misha. His cruelty reached its peak when he lobotomized a Justice Department official, cooked parts of his brain, and served it to him at dinner, while he was still alive. The 2002 Red Dragon is a prequel showing Lecter before imprisonment, helping and tormenting FBI agent Will Graham as they track down another serial killer. A more in-depth look at Lecter's life before The Silence of the Lambs, where his manipulation of Will Graham and his descent into pure depravity is seen in the TV series Hannibal. Physically, Hannibal Lecter is the definition of deceptive evil. Always impeccably dressed in tailored suits, unlike monstrous killers, his appearance is always, well, elegant. What makes Lecter so terrifying isn't just his taste for human flesh. Well, that is part of it, but it's also the way he carries himself. He's brilliant and well-mannered with an appreciation for art, music, and fine dining. Small but wiry, his maroon eyes glowed red under certain lights, and his teeth were sharp and unsettlingly white. He has a rare condition called mid-ray duplication polydactyly, which gives him an extra middle finger on his left hand. His slicked back, dark hair, widow's peak, and calm, refined expression suggests deep intelligence and something far more evil. Unlike other killers driven by rage or impulse, Lecter chooses his victims with cold calculation and completely lacks remorse. His cultured, polite demeanor makes him more terrifying than he already is. He can have a conversation about fine wines one moment and bite off a nurse's face the next, without breaking the conversation. He manipulates people psychologically before harming them physically. Whether it's Clarice in Silence of the Lambs or Will Graham in Hannibal, he toys with his prey like a cat before the kill. As a psychiatrist, Lecter understands human behavior so well that he can manipulate anyone. He possesses a near photographic memory and an encyclopedic knowledge of art, history, and literature. Despite his refined nature, he's physically deadly. He can kill swiftly, often using surgical precision. Let's not talk about how charming he is. His charm allows him to blend into high society despite his monstrous urges. Lecter isn't much of a healer, but he is an excellent chef. His idea of fine dining includes turning his victims into gourmet meals. Just ask that poor soul whose liver he paired with fava beans and Chianti. His skills as a doctor leave a lot to be desired, but when it comes to profiling serial killers, he's disturbingly sharp. Just don't accept an invitation to his house unless you're comfortable with the possibility of ending up on the menu. Lecter isn't just terrifying because he eats people, though that's more than enough. The reason he's on this list is because nobody does horror with a touch of elegance quite like Dr. Lecter. Dr. Joseph Heider, the human centipede. Dr. Joseph Heider isn't just another mad scientist. Well, that's not entirely true. Given the ways his mind works and the stunts he pulls, you certainly could call him a mad scientist. A former surgeon once respected for his work separating conjoined twins, Heider, instead of using his knowledge to heal, took his skills in the complete opposite direction and became obsessed with creating unnatural fusions of human bodies and stitching them together. Though the film never delves into his personal past in detail, Heider's demeanor suggests a deeply disturbed man with a god complex who believes he has the right to reshape human anatomy in whatever way he pleases. His horrific vision started with his own pets, 3 Rottweilers he surgically connected into a grotesque chain he called the 3-dog experiment. After their deaths, his ambition only grew. He wanted to push his experiment further, creating a so-called human centipede where each person became a segment connected mouth to anus in a living, suffering organism. Heider didn't care about his victims as people. To him, they were just raw materials, nothing more than test subjects for his sick masterpiece. He kidnapped 2 American tourists, Lindsay and Jenny, along with a Japanese man, Katsuro, to carry out his inhuman plan, surgically stitching them together mouth to anus, creating a single digestive system. The victims are forcibly transformed into the human centipede that he treats like a pet. One of his most disgusting acts was forcing the front segment, Katsuro, to defecate, while the middle victim, Lindsay, had no choice but to endure it. His cruelty didn't stop there. When 2 detectives got too close, Heider tried to drug them, planning to add them to his grotesque experiment. When that failed, he murdered them instead. Always dressed in a white lab coat or medical scrubs, Dr. Heider looks every bit the part of a classic mad scientist. A gaunt, sunken face with sharp, almost skeletal structure and deep-set eyes that look dead and disturbingly hollow. But you see, Heider isn't a raving lunatic. Instead, he's a highly intelligent and methodical killer. He doesn't kill recklessly, he experiments, treating people as toys. He has no tragic backstory, and he's not driven by revenge or hatred. His evil is pure, clinical, and detached. His victim's suffering means nothing to him beyond the success of his experiment. Heider strips people of their humanity completely and reconstructs them into something less than human. His centipede isn't just his science project, but a living testimony to his god complex. He doesn't just harm his victims, he enslaves them in a permanent state of agony where they don't even feel human anymore. While other horror villains might be frightening, Heider's detached, godlike cruelty makes him one of the more terrifying villains ever conceived. Dr. Frankenstein. Frankenstein. Various adaptations. The villainy of Dr. Frankenstein is more complex. He's both the creator and the destroyer, a man whose ambition leads to horror, yet who ultimately suffers for his actions. Frankenstein is a Swiss scientist born into a wealthy intellectual family. When kids played with toys, Frankenstein was obsessed with the secrets of life and death. Fascinated by the potential of bringing dead tissue back to life, Victor aimed to conquer death itself through science. He scavenges corpses, stitching together a being greater than man itself. However, the moment he succeeds in animating his creation, he's overcome with horror and disgust and abandons his monster to fend for itself. After all, when your patient is stitched together from exhumed corpses, waking up feeling alive takes on a whole new meaning. First introduced in Mary Shelley's 1818 novel Frankenstein, or The Modern Prometheus, the character has been adapted countless times through film, television, and literature. From the classic gothic scientist to a raving lunatic or even a sympathetic anti-hero, Dr. Frankenstein has been reimagined many ways. One of the most iconic portrayals is Colin Clive in 1931's Frankenstein and Bride of Frankenstein, which was released in 1935. In these depictions, we see Dr. Frankenstein as more of a tragic, regretful scientist than outright evil. In Bride of Frankenstein, he realizes his mistake but is still unable to control his creations. However, the 1957 Curse of Frankenstein portrays Dr. Frankenstein as more of a cold, calculating villain than a tragic figure. Unlike Clive's version, he feels no remorse and continues experimenting without conscience. The closest to the novel's depiction would probably be Kenneth Branagh in Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, which was released in 1994. The movie depicts Frankenstein's character, who has emotional depth but is still blinded by ambition. Frankenstein isn't evil in the obvious traditional sense. He's not a killer or a sadist. His evil comes through his arrogance, negligence, and refusal to take responsibility for his actions. He plays God without considering the consequences. Victor's desire to create life is rooted in personal glory rather than selflessness. He's evil because he immediately abandons his creation, leaving it to suffer, confused and alone. Instead of correcting the mistake, he lets it spiral into tragedy. Instead of helping his monstrous creation find peace, he drives it to desperation, leading to the deaths of his loved ones. Even as his life crumbles, Victor never fully acknowledges the depth of his mistake. His pride blinds him and prevents him from setting things right. Victor Frankenstein is a terrifying scientist because he represents the dangers of blind ambition and moral neglect. Because if you're going to embark on a quest to build life from the dead, there are a few ground rules. First, make sure your assistant doesn't accidentally grab the brain of a murderer, rookie mistake. Second, secure some real funding so you're not forced to conduct your weird experiments in a crumbling ancestral castle. And finally, if you're gonna play God, be prepared for the consequences. While his monster is the one feared by the world, it's Victor Frankenstein himself who's the true horror. The man who made life, rejected it, and watched as everything around him burnt to ruins. Dr. Moreau, the island of Dr. Moreau. If you had your own private tropical island, what would you do with it? Lounge on the beach, swim in crystal clear waters? Or would you lock yourself away in a hidden lab, stitching together human-animal hybrids in a nightmarish attempt to play God? Well, that's exactly what Dr. Moreau did, and it didn't end well for anyone involved. If Victor Frankenstein is the God complex of horror turned up to 10, then Dr. Moreau is that same madness set loose on an entire island. H.G. Wells' The Island of Dr. Moreau introduced us to a scientist who wasn't just tampering with life, he was reconstructing it to his own will. Dr. Moreau was once a celebrated scientist in London known for his extraordinary work in vivisection, which is live dissection. However, when his experiments became too extreme, he was shunned by society and forced into exile. But did that stop him? No way. Instead of abandoning his crazy ambitions, Moreau disappeared and set up shop on a remote island where he had no rules, no oversight, and nothing to stop him from pursuing his warped vision. There, he pushed the boundaries of science to force evolution itself, transforming animals into beast folk, ugly, semi-human creatures who existed in an unnatural state between man and beast. His goal was to create perfect beings by speeding up evolution. His method? Surgical torture and psychological conditioning. Moreau wanted to reshape animals into human-like beings, forcing them to walk, talk, and think like people. Moreau's House of Pain is a literal hellhole where creatures are sliced, stitched, and reshaped while fully conscious. But these weren't just mindless creatures, many of them still retained their human consciousness. His godlike rule is shattered when his creations realize he's just a man, and they turn on him. Once they taste blood and lose their fear, Moreau is hunted down and torn apart by his own creations. Dr. Moreau has white, wild hair, intelligent yet cold eyes, and is often seen in a blood-stained lab coat. Devoid of empathy, Dr. Moreau's evil isn't just about playing God, it's about his complete disregard for suffering. He doesn't even see pain as real. To him, his experiments are just stepping stones towards perfection, no matter how many screams echo through his laboratory. No remorse, no anesthesia, no second thoughts. Dr. Moreau is terrifying because his horror is rooted in real science gone wrong. He condemned innocent minds to a fate worse than death, all for the sake of proving he could. And, worst of all, he had no intention of ever stopping. Unlike Frankenstein, who did regret his actions, Moreau never doubted himself, not even for a moment. Dr. Christian Zell, Marathon Man. Some villains scare you with pure brutality, others terrify you with their cold intelligence, but Christian Zell from 1976's Marathon Man makes your skin crawl because he turns something as routine as dentistry into a pure psychological and physical torture session. Adapted from the 1974 novel, Marathon Man gave the world Dr. Christian Zell, the most sadistic Nazi dentist to ever hold a dental drill. Because what's worse than a Nazi? A Nazi dentist with a sadistic streak. Zell was a fugitive Nazi war criminal who built his fortune on diamonds stolen from Jewish prisoners at Auschwitz. While Zell enjoys a comfortable life in South America, his wealth is locked away in New York City. But when his brother, who had been safeguarding his wealth, dies in a car accident, Zell is forced out of hiding and returns to the US to reclaim his treasure. And he doesn't leave a clean trail. In one of the most disturbing torture scenes in film history, he drills into a helpless man's tooth without anesthesia, coldly interrogating him the entire time. Zell is the kind of villain that stays with you, making even a routine dentist appointment feel a little too awkward. He isn't just terrifying because he's a Nazi war criminal, he's terrifying because he's calculated, sadistic, and utterly indifferent to human suffering. He takes something as harmless as dentistry and turns it into a method of pure horror. His evil is realistic, but that's what makes him unforgettable. Some horror villains come from the supernatural, some wear masks and wield chainsaws, but Zell, he just asks, is it safe? And then the drill starts whirring. So if there's one dentist appointment you want to miss, it's one with Dr. Zell. Even the worst root canal would be paradise compared to what he has in store. Dr. Carl Hill, Reanimator. We've seen our fair share of mad scientists already, but Dr. Carl Hill from Reanimator takes things to a whole new level. Unlike your usual power-hungry doctor, Hill doesn't just lose his mind, he literally loses his head and keeps on going. If you've ever wondered what happens when an egotistical, power-obsessed scientist gets his hands on the secret to reanimation, the answer is pure unhinged chaos. Dr. Carl Hill starts out as a respected but deeply unethical scientist working alongside Dr. Herbert West. While West is obsessed with perfecting his glowing green resurrection serum, Hill is obsessed with stealing credit for other people's work and maybe taking over the world while he's at it. West saw right through him, calling his work outdated and labeling him a fraud. Hill, furious at being challenged, was initially blinded by rage, but when he realized West had actually succeeded in reanimating the dead, his anger turned into something far worse: obsession. Hill is a charlatan, a man who built his reputation by plagiarizing the research of better scientists while putting on an air of intellectual superiority. He has a sick fascination with controlling life and death, and when he discovers West's secret serum, his greed and ambition explode. Determined to steal West's breakthrough for himself, Hill tried to blackmail it. Unfortunately for him, West doesn't take kindly to intellectual theft. That plan ended quickly when West straight up chopped off Hill's head with a shovel like he's taking out the trash. But does that stop Hill? Not even slightly. Using West's serum, Hill reanimates himself separately. His body moves on its own while his severed head plots revenge. Hill's intelligence remained fully intact, and even worse, he discovered he could control his own body telepathically. Now undead and madder than ever, Hill uses his mind control abilities to raise an army of reanimated corpses hell-bent on taking over the university and then some. Oh, and did I mention he tries to get intimate with Megan, the protagonist's girlfriend, while also being just a severed head? Yeah, that happens. Before losing his head, Dr. Hill looks like your classic pompous scientist. Middle-aged, silver-haired, dressed in a formal suit or lab coat, and always smug, with an air like he already owns the world. After the shovel-to-the-neck incident, however, he's a severed head on a tray, although still talking and still scheming. So you see, not so different. His reanimated headless body moves separately, sometimes carrying his own head. Even when he's reduced to a head in a dish, he just refuses to quit. Between his creepy obsession with control, his mind-controlling undead army, and his literal talking head antics, he's the definition of over-the-top horror. Dr. Arden, American Horror Story, Asylum. If there's one thing the 2012 American Horror Story Asylum proved, it's that real-life horror is just as terrifying as the supernatural, and no character embodies that better than Dr. Arthur Arden. A sadistic, egomaniacal Nazi war criminal, Arden isn't just playing Doctor, he's creating hideous mutilated superhumans out of innocent patients under the guise of medical research. His methods were torture, disfigurement, and unspeakable cruelty to create a version of human evolution that only makes sense inside his deranged mind. Same old, same old. Dr. Arden, born Hans Gruber, was a Nazi doctor during World War II who conducted human experiments in the name of scientific progress. After the war, he fled to America, erased his past, and took on a new identity. By the 1960s, he had become the head doctor at Briarcliff Manor, an asylum. This gave him the perfect playground to continue his inhumane experiments without anyone batting their eyes. Under the guise of psychiatric care, Arden carried out barbaric, unethical procedures on the asylum's patients, turning them into monstrous, disfigured creatures that he dumped into the surrounding woods like trash. But why? Well, because he believed he was making them stronger. Standing at 6'7" with a shaved scalp and a Van Dyke beard, Arden was ghostly pale, but beneath his towering frame and carefully maintained persona lurked a broken man, one whose cruelty had no limits. He sees nothing wrong with the horrors he inflicted during the war or the ones he continues at Briarcliff. Despite all his twisted ambitions, he genuinely believes that his monstrous actions serve a higher purpose. This guy wasn't just a villain, he was a walking nightmare in a lab coat and a reminder that real evil isn't always supernatural. His belief in progress at any cost made him a menace to humanity, and his complete lack of empathy made him one of the most hated villains in American horror story history. While other mad scientists created monsters, Arden was one himself, and in the end, even he realized there was no redemption. Dr. Satan, House of 1,000 Corpses. Some horror villains kill, some torture, but Dr. Satan? He takes his victims, rips them apart, and rebuilds them into nasty-looking, mindless killing machines. Originally, Dr. S. Quinton Quayle was a deranged surgeon. As an intern at Willows County Mental Hospital, he had unrestricted access to vulnerable patients, and he took full advantage of it. Instead of treating the mentally ill, he used them as test subjects in brutal surgical experiments, determined to create a super race of mutated killers through inhumane brain operations. It wasn't medicine, it was torture disguised as science. Eventually, the townspeople discovered his horrific experiments and hung him from a tree, but the legend of Dr. Satan didn't end there. By the next morning, his body had vanished without a trace. Some believed he had escaped, others thought something far darker was at play. Over time, his story became nothing more than a tale whispered around campfires, but Dr. Satan was no myth. He was still alive. Somehow, he survived his execution and went into hiding beneath the Firefly family's property, where he continued his experiments. Every Halloween, the Fireflies lured new victims and threw them down into the catacombs where Dr. Satan eagerly awaited. Those who survived his experiments became his loyal, monstrous henchmen. The failures, if they lived, were left to rot in the caves. Introduced in Rob Zombie's House of 1,000 Corpses, Dr. Satan is less of a man and more of a legend and really looks the part. His hideous face is hidden behind an oxygen mask, his mouth sewn shut, time and madness have corrupted him into something barely human. Dr. Satan is what happens when a surgeon stops caring about humanity and starts caring only about meaningless perfection. He became a name whispered in fear, a boogeyman lurking in the shadows. He's the kind of horror villain who doesn't just kill you, he makes sure you never die properly. And if you hear his name whispered in the dark, you had better pray that you don't wake up on his operating table. Dr. Giggles. Dr. Giggles. When it comes to doctors you never want to meet, Dr. Giggles might be the top of the list. He's not just a sadistic, scalpel-wielding lunatic, he's a walking horror pun factory with a medical bag full of deadly tricks and a laugh that'll haunt your nightmares. If Freddy Krueger went to med school and specialized in slasher film insanity, you'd get Dr. Giggles. Dr. Evan Rendell Jr., better known as Dr. Giggles, wasn't born a monster, he was turned into one. His obsession with surgery began early. His father, Dr. Evan Rendell Sr., was a psychotic surgeon in the small town of Moorhigh. When the elder Rendell's wife became sick, he went off the deep end, believing he could save her by removing the hearts of live patients. The town found out and tore him apart lynch mob style. While his father met a brutal end, little Evan saw it all, and instead of thinking, maybe I should seek therapy, he thought, time to carry on Dad's legacy with a lot more laughing. As a kid, Evan was locked in a mental institution, but years later, he escaped and went back to his hometown to resume his family business, murder. He donned his father's white coat and picked up where dear old Dad left off. His mission? Basically kill everyone in town, with a doctor's touch. Oh, and how can we forget his maniacal giggle? That's the last thing you'll hear before he slices you open. His giggle isn't just for show, he genuinely enjoys it. Every victim gets a themed, over-the-top medical kill delivered with a morbid one-liner. He's a full-on horror comedian who stabs first and puns later.
Everyone's a hero in
Dr. Horrible. Dr. Horrible's sing-along blog. Most evil doctors carry out horrific experiments to create something of their own, or even just to have some plain old fun, but not Dr. Horrible. He just wants to join an evil club, impress his crush, and maybe, just maybe, change the world for the better. Played by Neil Patrick Harris in Dr. Horrible's sing-along blog, this tragic wannabe supervillain is as funny as he is heartbreaking. He's a dork with a PhD in mad science, a big dream, and the worst luck ever. Dr. Horrible is an aspiring supervillain in training with big dreams of being accepted into the prestigious Evil League of Evil, led by the legendary Bad Horse, the thoroughbred of sin, who's actually just literally a horse, but there's a problem. He's terrible at being bad. He narrates his villainous journey through a personal video blog where he shares his plans, frustrations, and failures with the world. Before he can make his mark on the world of villainy, he has to deal with his arch nemesis, Captain Hammer, the insufferable, egotistical, muscle-bound, idiotic superhero who constantly humiliates him. Dr. Horrible isn't really evil, but he wants to be. Unlike true villains, Dr. Horrible doesn't enjoy hurting people, he just wants recognition. He's actually a genius. His failure isn't a lack of intelligence, it's just his terrible luck and soft heart. The moment his crush Penny dies, he loses everything. He becomes a real villain, not because he wants to, but because he has nothing left. Dr. Horrible set out to be a villain, but ended up being a tragedy. All he ever wanted was love and respect, but in the end, he lost the only thing that mattered to it. The real horror? He never got to be the hero in his own story. If he weren't so distracted by Penny, Dr. Horrible could have been unstoppable.
We are too late.
Dr. Philip K. Decker, Nightbreed. By day, Dr. Philip K. Decker is a calm, calculating psychiatrist. By night, he's a butcher of families. Dr. Decker presents himself as a brilliant psychiatrist, treating his patients with what seems like calm, collected professionalism. But beneath the suit and polite demeanor, he's a stone-cold psychopath who gets his real thrills from slaughtering Nightbreed, an underground community of supernatural creatures. However, he has no qualms about killing humans too, no exception. Dr. Decker has spent years carving his way through families, wiping them out in brutal massacres. He wears a nightmarish mask while killing, transforming himself into a faceless specter of death. He believes monsters should die, but secretly, he's the worst monster of them all. A master manipulator, a wolf in doctor's clothing, he manipulates his own patient, Boone, into believing he's the serial killer. That's some next-level villainy right there. Using his profession to hide in plain sight while committing brutal murders, Dr. Decker wears the perfect mask of normalcy. But when he's out slaughtering families, he prefers wearing a pale, skin-crawling mask with black, lifeless button eyes and a stitched-up grin, along with leather gloves and a long coat. The mask isn't just a disguise, but his real face. When he puts it on, he's free to be what he truly is, pure evil. Despite being cunning, Decker ultimately meets his end, but with his level of evil, is he ever truly gone? Dr. Jonathan Crane, Scarecrow, Dark Knight, and Batman series. Gotham City is crawling with maniacs, but while most of them rely on guns, strength, or chaotic mayhem, Dr. Jonathan Crane, better known as the Scarecrow, plays a different game. His weapon? Fear, hallucinations. Your own mind is turning against you. Whether in the comics, animated series, or even Christopher Nolan's Dark Knight trilogy, Dr. Crane proves that fear is the most powerful weapon of all. As a child, Crane was scrawny, awkward, and relentlessly bullied. His abusive, fanatically religious grandmother locked him in a chapel for hours, using fear as punishment. Instead of succumbing to terror, he became obsessed with understanding it and eventually controlling it. Crane became a brilliant psychologist specializing in fears and phobias, but his unorthodox experiments on students and patients got him fired from Gotham University. Eventually, Crane fully embraced his alter ego, Scarecrow. The Scarecrow is one of Batman's most infamous foes, and the Dark Knight trilogy reimagines him as a corrupt psychopharmacologist with a terrifying agenda. As the chief administrator of Arkham Asylum, Dr. Jonathan Crane isn't interested in curing patients. Instead, he's far more invested in breaking them. Crane has perfected a fear-inducing toxin, a chemical weapon that distorts reality and forces its victims to experience their worst nightmares. Instead of using his knowledge to heal minds, he weaponizes it, pushing Gotham deeper into madness. His experiments attract the attention of the League of Shadows, and together they hatch a plan to unleash the toxin across the entire city, turning Gotham into a living nightmare. After Arkham collapsed, Crane went rogue, selling his fear toxins to criminals. During Bane's reign, Crane took over as Gotham's judge, sentencing people to death or exile. Cillian Murphy's Scarecrow was calm, calculating, and unnervingly detached, making him one of the most realistic and terrifying versions of the character. Even without the need for drama, Crane is unsettling, but when he wears his signature burlap mask, complete with a hangman's noose, he becomes something straight out of a horror movie. Most villains have an end goal. Money, power, or simply piping hot chaos, but Scarecrow just wants to watch people break and watch them suffer. He has no super strength, no high-tech gadgets, just pure hallucinations working for him, and somehow he still makes Batman struggle. Crane only wants to prove that fear is the most powerful weapon, and that everyone, no matter how strong, can be controlled through terror. And in a city like Gotham, that makes him one of the most dangerous threats of all. Marvelous verdict. Alright, let's get real. Evil doctors in movies and TV are terrifying, but they're also kinda fascinating. One second, you think you're getting a routine checkup, and the next, you're strapped to an operating table while some lunatic in a lab coat monologues about pushing the boundaries of science. No thank you. And yet, for all their horror, we keep watching. Maybe it's the thrill of it, or maybe it's because deep down, we love a good villain, especially one who can terrify us with nothing but a scalpel and a smirk. So, next time you're at the doctor's office and hear the words, "This won't hurt a bit," just be glad. At least they're not taking inspiration from Hollywood. That's all we got for you this time, but if you liked our content, don't forget to leave a like and subscribe to us if you haven't already. Thanks for watching, stay safe out there, and have a marvelous day.